Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Philosophy Hour of Literary Tales. I'm your host, Paul Krause, and in this episode, we look at the aesthetic philosophy of Russell Kirk. If people have any recognition of the name Russell Kirk, it is probably associated with a vague understanding of American political conservatism. Kirk was, of course, conservative, an early founder of the modern conservative movement alongside Peter Viereck, that eventually gained more prominence with William F. Buckley Jr. and the National Review crowd. And Kirk also wrote for National Review, although he did not have the best relationship with William F. Buckley. But Kirk's conservatism, like many before him and many after him, wasn't really rooted in politics as such, but in art, an understanding of aesthetics and the soul, which can inspire the human imagination and its pilgrimage to the sun, moon, and the other stars that call us to the beauty that lay beyond it. Kirk was influenced by Romanticism, as well as the New Humanists, and the New Humanists, who were conservative, were preserving the essential nature of humanity, the idea of the aesthetic and the imaginative way of life, which was under threat by materialism, liberalism, capitalism, socialism, communism, anything that threatened to extinguish the human soul. The aesthetic understanding of life and the spirit of art was really at the central core of Kirk's conservatism, just as that notion had been among the New Humanists. Real literature is something much better than a harmless instrument for getting through idle hours. The purpose of great literature is to help us develop into full human beings. That is a wonderful statement by Russell Kirk that encapsulates his aesthetic attitude, his philosophy of literature, humanism, and conservatism. Kirk wrote to humane readers, articulating the necessity of a reading, literary life, a life of a mind, to conserve the life of the soul, which is the mind, in the midst of our mechanical way of life. It had an indelible impact on my own outlook, my outlook on art and literature, as well as the importance of art, aesthetics, and literature to human life. Anyone who is familiar with my channel should automatically be able to see that. From Alexander Pope and Edmund Burke to Matthew Arnold, T.S. Eliot, Irving Babbitt, Peter Viereck, and Russell Kirk himself, to more recently Sir Roger Scruton, my former professor when I studied in England, the real spirit of conservative luminaries, all of whom I just mentioned, has been the defense of art and beauty, and their enduring relevance to human existence, and the shaping of the human soul and its imagination. True soulcraft, then, isn't the politics of moderation, or, of course, the notion of low taxes and pro-business economics. It is in art. True soulcraft is found in aesthetics. The battle for soulcraft is waged in the domain of the imagination, and not the halls and institutions of politics or the media. Though Kirk is a tremendous influence on myself and the conservative movement on a whole, it is really Kirk's idea of the aesthetic life, which should be what readers and listeners know best about Kirk. Any astute reader of his, or anyone who is familiar with his literary connections, should be able to detect that aesthetics, art, and imagination guided everything in Russell Kirk's outlook, whether it was his writings on politics or, of course, his writings on literature. His writings on politics, for instance, sought to maintain a political society and a political system that allowed and permitted the study of the humanities rather than scientific socialism or the pragmatic sciences and economics, Rather than push us, rather than have education push us into a materialist direction, Kirk sought to retain, through literature, a politics that allowed literature and the artistic life to flourish. Like many of the other conservative theorists, Kirk's political ruminations are also what made him famous, even though he wrote far more on education and the philosophy of art and aesthetics. He was also a noted novelist. He wrote a great number of Gothic novels, which sustained him later in life. Kirk's hero was Edmund Burke. Burke is famous for his reflections on the Revolution in France, even though his philosophical writings, especially his contributions to aesthetics, are actually far more important for people to know. As mentioned, Kirk's most famous work is associated with politics, like his hero Burke, but Kirk's most frequent and grandest contributions lay beyond what he wrote on politics. The philosopher and aesthete from Mecosta, Michigan, shouldn't be, as he is, unfortunately, known as a mere theorist of political conservatism. Kirk's most famous work, his 1953 book, The Conservative Mind, From Burke to Eliot, is often read from a political point of view. But this distracts us from the intense study of the aesthetic side to the readers and the great thinkers of the conservative movement. After all, it ends with T.S. Eliot, who is one of the great poets of the 20th century. There are other great writings that Kirk made: Enemies of the Permanent Things, Observations of Abnormality in Literature and Politics, as well as The Sword of Imagination, Memoirs of a Half-Century of Literary Conflict. Not to mention Eliot and His Age, T.S. Eliot's moral imagination in the 20th century. As you can tell from the titles of all of these books, this is what constitutes the real genius of Russell Kirk, and where his heart was actually planted. It was in the life of literature. It was in the life of the moral imagination. The heart of Kirk's philosophy lay in what it means to be human and how humanity is found in art, aesthetics, literature, and high culture. He was part of the ancient tradition, going back to the Greek philosophers, developed forward by Christian theologians, and more recently, within the same century and even the same decades as he was writing, the New Humanists of Irving Babbitt, Paul Elmer More. What does it mean to be human? Thus, like all the conservatives before and after him, Kirk was really a theorist of the human sentiments. Emanuel Wallerstein, a great Marxist intellectual of the past generation, defined conservatism in its philosophical reality as essentially, quote, anti-political and rooted in, quote, feeling and intuition, end quote. From Wallerstein and the true Marxist intellectuals who actually know something about conservatism, unlike what you find on CNN or MSNBC, their notion that conservatism was anti-political and rooted in feeling and intuition is because they understood that conservatism, properly understood in its philosophical sense, had nothing to do with political ideology. It wasn't dogmatic. It was an outlook of the soul and of human existence, rooted in the romantic sentiments of feeling, intuition, and the imagination. The insights of Wallerstein are critical for understanding Russell Kirk and the broader conservative tradition he identified with, defended, and promoted. Kirk's consideration on the human condition, while not disparaging human rationality, was really tied to a bifurcated understanding of the human emotions rooted in the Greek philosophic and Christian theological traditions. Following in the footsteps of one of his great idols and heroes, as well as one of my own great idols and heroes, John Milton, Kirk identified a position a position of positive and negative embodiment of the passions, emotions, and feelings. We could have feelings of envy, jealousy, and hatred which, like Milton's Satan in Paradise Lost, lead us down the path of sin and destruction. These feelings are fleeting and bring great regret and disorientation to the soul and to human life. We could alternatively have feelings of fulfillment, joy, and pleasantry, the weeping grace of the embodiment of love and beauty, per Burke, and the equivalent prelapsarian sentimentalism experienced by Adam and Eve, captured so splendidly in Milton's Paradise Lost, prior to their fall, ode to the envy of Satan. From this Assyrian garden, where the fiend saw undelighted all delight, all kind of living creatures new and strange to sight, to a far nobler shape, erect and tall, godlike erect, with native honor clad in naked majesty, seem lords of all. Ordered liberty, Kirk's most famous phrase, is tied to this sentimentalism he concerned himself with, the sentimentalism of the ordered passions and the life of erotic fulfillment and the life of imaginative contentment. The idea of Kirk's ordered liberty was drawn from Aristotle, Cicero, and the Stoics, and in other degrees from Christianity, especially in its spiritual and monastic practices, the spiritual discipline needed to live an orderly life. From these ancient theorists, Kirk concurred with, there is the need for a strong discipline in all aspects of life if humans are to enjoy human liberty. To be enslaved by the passions, following Epictetus, entailed the degradation of personal liberty, and once all society was enslaved to the passions, liberty would disappear. Liberty here isn't in the post-Hobbesian sense of being able to easily and most sufficiently obtain one's bodily desires. Liberty, in Kirk, following the ancients, which you see all the way through the Renaissance and the early modern period, with writers such as Milton and Harrington, liberty is about the cultivation of excellence, which permits actual free choice, the free choice of the will to make its decision in the near infinite hierarchy of goods to embody in one's life, and to come and recognize the hierarchy of goods and progressively grow to choose higher goods en route to the transcendentals, the greatest of which is beauty, is what Kirk's philosophy of literature and aesthetics is all about. Because literature, the ordered life of reading, teaches us about the supremacy of beauty, and beauty as the greatest good that one can embody. The idea of ordered liberty in Kirk is also, again, implicit, and in some places explicit, in his artistic and literary apologia. Let us return now for a moment to what Kirk said about literature. Real literature is something much better than a harmless instrument for getting through idle hours. The purpose of great literature is to help us to develop into full human beings. Again, this is because literature teaches us about the human condition, human nature, human desires. For instance, I often tell students that one of the essential things to master as aspiring writers, as well as readers, is the cultivation of the discipline of schedule or habitual reading and writing. It may seem restrictive at first, but once mastered, it will produce a great degree of freedom. Rather than being rushed to reading massive amounts of text or the need to cram several thousand words into a paper into a short period of time, the disciplined reading and writing life not only allows the eventual mastering of the writing craft, but opens up ourselves to the treasures of literature and allowing them to develop us into full human beings. It also leads to leisure, the use of our time not in a hectic frenzy, but in a genuine enjoyment of the arts, of literature, of philosophy. Kirk's defense and promotion of the arts is rooted in his promotion of ordered liberty as it relates to the transcendental order of things that he sought to be united with. As he said, the moral imagination aspires to the apprehending of right order in the soul and right order in the commonwealth. This moral imagination was the gift and the obsession of Plato, Virgil, and Dante. The ordered artistic life, the disciplined life of reading and reflections on art and literature, make us free from demagoguery, polemicism, and the sophistry of the dictatorship of the negative passions. The liberty of the disciplined aesthetic life permits us to ascend that ladder of being toward the beautiful, the greatest of the transcendental values. And in this ascent to beauty, the arts guide the way for us, for the arts encapsulate the beauty, the truth, the love, and the goodness of the cosmos. In promoting the arts, Kirk believed that great books had the power to bring that sentimentalism of love that was tied to beauty in the considerations of Plato, Plotinus, Augustine, Burke, and Eliot into our lives through the study of the great books, through the study of literature, through our engagement with the arts. The beauty that encapsulated and enraptured the souls of the great minds of the past and the great minds still so recent to us can be achieved by everyone. In wrestling with beauty, and God is beauty, we come to be transformed and transfigured into that original beauty, that grace, so to speak, that constitutes the essence of being human. Thus, as Kirk says, great literature helps us to develop into full human beings, and this possibility is open to all. And this possibility is open to all in a democratic society. This is why Kirk was such a strong defender of democracy during the Cold War and such an ardent opponent to communism and socialism, which would destroy the transcendental and the artistic and literary possibilities open to citizens. Furthermore, it's important to point out that the arts are themselves moral, or at least a proper understanding of art is meant to be moral. The idea of aesthetic morality was not unique to Kirk. It is found in Plotinus and Augustine. It's also in some degrees found in Plato. In more modern times, it is also promoted by the Earl of Shaftesbury and Thomas Reid during the Anglo-Scottish Enlightenment. And Kirk was a student of the Anglo-Scottish Enlightenment. Kirk's Gothic novels are often set in Scotland. Kirk had a certain love for the Scottish intellectual tradition. Kirk, in identifying the gentleness of moral ethics with beauty, followed in the long-standing path of philosophical aesthetics, leading to his greater love and greater appreciation of the arts, which he then wished to share with everyone. Kirk's identification of the beautiful with the good is what led him to his final consideration on that famous phrase of his, the moral imagination. The moral imagination, according to Kirk, is the acme and the apotheosis of the human soul and its journey toward beauty and love. The moral imagination truly embodies the total human condition, its pilgrim nature, desire to love itself, and resulting in a sense and an embodiment of sentimental serenity, the feeling of satisfaction, which is related to eudaimonia, or happiness. The moral imagination moves with the fullest imitation also of the divine. The moral imagination creates out of love and beauty, just as the Christian theologians had asserted in understanding the free gift of creation. The moral imagination is the closest we come to the transcendentals in this life. The moral imagination is the closest we come to the fullest imitation of the divine, because just as the divine created out of that gift of love and beauty, the moral imagination creates out of love and beauty and shares it with the world and we all become better human beings when we encounter the moral imagination. In the end, Kirk couched his aesthetic outlook with a warning that has come true today with all who pillory the arts and the humanities as worthless. He recognized that it would not bring earthly success or power. There exists no guarantee, he writes, that such books as I have suggested will bring us material success or earthly power. Yet he called us up to the stars despite this reality. As he says, such reading will teach us about what it is to be a real man or a real woman. The richest life is the life of the aesthetic imagination, the artistic soul that dwells in the beauty of the arts and is transfigured by the beauty of the arts. More than the author of modern conservatism, as he is sometimes claimed to be, Kirk is the prophet offering a revived sense of aesthetic transfiguration and salvation through the arts. And that is what his conservatism was really about, conserving the aesthetic reality and the moral imagination of human existence, threatened by political totalitarianism rooted in materialism. Those influenced by Kirk have, as a result, never had a problem in understanding that the essence of conservatism is found in aesthetics, and the aesthetic soul doesn't look for earthly power, but looks for a cosmic power, a higher reality, that reality of the heavens and the suns, which will last forever amid the warring kingdoms of this world that will stretch far away and eventually decay.